Good afternoon, everybody. Both those of you here in person and those of you watching online. I'm Rick Hassan of the Legislative School of Law and of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I want to welcome you to today's installment of the Spring 2024 webinar series for the Safeguarding Democracy Project. We're fortunate that we're conducting this one in person as well, not just online. I want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their logistical support today. And I want to tell you about the final upcoming programs for the spring semester for the Safeguarding Democracy Project. On Tuesday, April 16th at 12:30 p.m., I'll be in conversation with California Attorney General Rob Bonta on preserving democracy in the United States. The event is moderated by Stephen Cobb, an ABA Democracy Fellow and a Cozen O'Connor member. That event is co-sponsored by the American Bar Association's Defending Democracy Initiative. A link to watch this event online is available at the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. The event is free, but registration is required. And then on May 9th, at I believe it's 7 p.m., the Hammer Museum will be hosting a viewing of a new film called War Games about potential threats to the peaceful transition of power in 2024. It's a fascinating film. I'll be speaking with some of the participants in this war game that was filmed. Details about that event will eventually be on the Safeguarding Democracy Project website. Right now, you can find them at that UCLA Hammer Museum. And then that will be the last event for us for the spring semester. We'll be back in the fall semester, which begins here in August with a new series of events. Today, we turn to the topic of race and the risk of election subversion, and I'm thrilled to introduce a really all-star panel of speakers. Sophia Lalekan is the director of ACLU's Voting Rights Project and assists in the planning, strategy, and supervision of the ACLU's voting rights litigation nationwide. She has an active docket protecting voting rights and combating voter suppression around the country, and has led or worked on successful challenges to discriminatory laws in Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. Among the cases listed is a case called Fish versus Kobach, which took up the first chapter of my book, and I think was the most important election trial of the century so far. And I also saw Crystal Mason listed on there. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. Sophia received her JD from Stanford Law School and her MS in Management Science Engineering and Political Science from Stanford. Spencer Overton is the Patricia Roberts Harris Research Professor of Law at George Washington University, and he's research published and taught extensively on democracy and race. He directs the GW Equity Institute's Multiracial Democracy Project, which serves as the bridge between scholars, policymakers, civil rights organizations, and democracy groups to tackle challenges like racialized disinformation, gerrymandering, and voter suppression. He's currently working on projects related to the regulation of AI to facilitate a well-functioning multiracial democracy and the implications of alternative voting systems for multiracial democracy. Professor Overton led several senior leadership roles during the Obama campaign transition administration. During the 2008 presidential campaign, he led over 140 experts as chair of the campaign's Government Reform Policy Committee. I'm not going to keep reading.
Thank you.
But you can look up his.
Thank you.
I will mention that from 2014 to 2023, Professor Overton served as the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, America's Black think tank, which he essentially brought back to life and has made a very vibrant organization today. He clerked for U.S. Court of Appeals Judge David Keith and graduated with honors from both Hampton University and Harvard Law School. And Sony Blackman, our local favorite, is program manager of the UCLA Voting Rights Project and Voting Rights Council. Sony believes that to ensure an equitable democracy, elections must be free, fair, and devoid of systemic racism. Watkman is responsible for managing all aspects of the Voting Rights Project, including the project's fellowship program and legal scholarship. She's currently counsel on Code of Palmer versus Hobbs. I think you just had a win last week.
I did, I had a nice big one.
She recently defended the constitutionality of Washington's Voting Rights Act, Washington State's Voting Rights Act for a legal challenge. She has wanted to be a voting rights litigator since she was in high school. Previously, she interned with the ACLU Voting Rights Project and for Common Cause's National Redistricting Project. She holds her JD from UCLA School of Law and is an alumna of the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law, which means something to people in this room, probably more than the people on Zoom. I will ask a series of questions, but I hope that we'll have time for questions from those of you here in person. Unfortunately, due to technological limitations, we won't be taking questions from people online during this program. So welcome to all of you. It's great to have you here. And let me start, I'll start with Spencer and work our way down the line. And I'll just start with a small question. What's that? Would you want me to work this way?
No.
So let me start with a small question. What do you think is the greatest risk or risks to free and fair elections in 2024, particularly for voters of color?
Well, Rick, thank you. And, also just thanks for your leadership in terms of our field. And that's, just immeasurable. Great to be here with Sony and Sophia. I'm sure they know much more about restrictions and some of the litigation that's going on. So I want to focus on a couple of challenges that are maybe a little different, right? One challenge, and I don't know that we're going to solve it in this election cycle, has to do with culture. And when I talk about culture, certainly I'm talking about cultural anxiety that's driving a lack of commitment to democratic principles. We can talk all day about the Electoral Count Reform Act, but if we ignore culture, we're missing the boat, right? We can set up structures like ERIC to make sure, roles are accurate, but then when, 9 states basically defect in part for cultural reasons, it's something we gotta deal with, right? So when I talk about culture, I'm talking about both cultural anxiety, and I'm also talking about our collective commitment to democratic norms. So this notion of us being willing to say, hey, I didn't win an election, but I'm committed to democracy, even though somebody else won this time. So that culture is one big risk. I think another issue is this local targeting piece, because elections are organized and administered on a local level. When we think about places like Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, these places, I think that we talk about just targeting in terms of these areas, whether it's deceptive practices, threats to election workers, cyber attacks, challengers at the polls, litigation that's kind of challenging either the voting rolls or mail-in ballots, board members on these local election boards denying certification or delaying certification. And so those, I think, are significant issues. And even in those places where there are resources, right? If you look in a place like North Carolina or Georgia, there are a lot of rural counties. There are fewer voters, but they don't have some of the same resources as some of these larger counties like Wayne County. And they might be particularly susceptible to cyber attacks or other local challenges. So culture and kind of local attacks are my big concerns and risks.
I'm surprised you didn't say AI.
Well, I'm going to get to that. AI facilitates some of these things, but
Yeah, I'm going to want to ask you about, whether we're just too hysterical because it's, something we're not familiar with. So it can, maybe it's overblown.
And I hope this isn't my last time.
Ciao.
So thank you, and I wanted to echo the thanks and for your leadership as well as for just including me in this program. And I'm very curious to hear what all of you are interested in thinking about, in part because I echo much of what Spencer has said about one of the things that keeps me up at night. Let's be clear, my job, I think, as a general matter, is to be thinking about all of the things that might be keeping all of us up at night and figuring out how do we respond. That's what I do. There's so many things that we could be here for a really long time. But when I, just as a personal matter, thinking about, okay, what's changed? What is a problem for not just with the 2024 election, but I think for democracy as a whole going forward. And it is this view of this cultural view, right? We haven't changed this country, in my view of, voting should be accessible, it should be available, it should be, everyone should be treated fairly in this process. That's led to some, secure protections for all voters, especially those of color. That is gone, that is completely gone right now, and we're in a place where, there is unfortunately a view, I would say, that no matter how safe and secure the elections are, at the end of the day, it's not clear to me that anyone will believe that they were. And that's a change, cultural change, a shift in how people are viewing democratic institutions, elections as a whole, electoral processes and the like. And that's something that I can't really fix, right? In my role, certainly. Although I think we certainly try, right, in terms of how to communicate, how to talk about this. But I think related to this sort of shift in, this is an all-out war, and just the outcome matters. It doesn't even matter what the process is like. Do we care about whether or not the process was free and fair almost? Is a sense of despair, right? And they're related to each other. This view that no matter what we do, something bad is going to happen and we can't fix it. So why are we trying? What is the point? What is the point of trying to create reforms? What is the point if no one, if we're not gonna be able to get people together to believe in that, to have faith, to have these peaceful transitions of power, to believe in what the courts say, and have confidence in that. And that is problematic for many reasons. But if you're just thinking 2024, and what we need to do in order to ensure that there are free and fair elections, and that people are participating in the political process, especially marginalized voters who are bearing the brunt of so many attacks and feeling like their votes don't count, don't matter, that their participation doesn't matter. This sense that that is being reinforced, that no matter what we say, no matter what we do, no matter how many times we go to court, no matter how many times we ask our legislature to do something different, it doesn't change. So why fight? Why think creatively? Why try to reform the system if at the end of the day, it doesn't matter? When I go out and talk to people, our members, our clients, people that we work with, this is a recurring theme of, I'm just not sure our democracy is going to make it. I'm not sure, no matter what happens in this election, that maybe this will be the last election, and we'll just go from there. And that sense of despair and hopelessness is really problematic in my view, in terms of really doing what we can to ensure democracy going forward.
I want to come back to you and talk about this idea of demobilization. Sometimes I hear like, don't even talk about the problems with our elections. But doing so, it makes turn people off. They're not going to vote. So we'll come back to that. But I want to bring Sunny into the conversation and ask you, what are you feeling and seeing this time through?
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for having me and thank everyone for coming and being here. I echo much of what you all said, but one thing I'm really focused on, I do a lot of work, particularly in small counties, all across the country. And it's really just the lack of a real watchdog, right? So the best way I can illustrate this point of really what I'm concerned about is I do some work in Washington State. They have signature verification. And in a lot of these smaller counties in Eastern Washington that are primarily farm counties, huge Hispanic population, just Hispanic names get flagged. We had a lawsuit about this and we successfully settled it and changed some of the processes, but you have these folks who are county elected officials, sit on the review board, and their Latino ballots are just disproportionately getting flagged. And then also, Black ballots are disproportionately getting flagged, and Native American ballots. Every ballot except, generally white voters' ballots were getting flagged. And the state had a nice report about it, but they didn't do anything. Like the state attorney general didn't sue any of these counties or enforce it, and they only knew it was a problem because we filed a lawsuit about it, and then they had this audit that the legislature ordered. The question for me is, how many more voting rights groups have to be out there policing what these local places do? Because there's so many local places, there's so many counties that run elections in this country, and what we found was that in some of these local races, someone won by 2 votes and they rejected 7 Hispanic ballots, right? So what was the outcome of that, right? We will never know what that was. And how do you convince people that their votes matter when they're getting thrown out? And it's a cultural thing, but it's also a processes thing. And the fact that we don't really have, we've allowed as a country so much of the voting rights enforcement to be done by like local groups, and not by the government. There's really a lack of commitment, I think, there to enforce their own policies and procedures against local subdivisions. And that's really a concern for me, among a lot of the other concerns, like, I'm sure we'll talk about this. When is it too late and too early to sue over an election change? But I think really having to figure out what places we're gonna target is hard. I think, I'm sure Sophia feels the same way about that.
Well, and even more, in a more dire way, you can think about what's happened in the Eighth Circuit, the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit ruled that private parties can't even sue under Section 2. That suit, I assume that suit is going to, maybe you can't say, you'll have a poker face, whether there's gonna be a cert petition filed in that suit in the next few days, but, time's ticking, but this is a huge issue. If we lost the private ability to enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, you lose over 90% of the cases in this country. So that's a new threat. I mean, that wasn't even on most people's agenda until Justice Gorsuch decided to have a throwaway line in a concurring opinion that was inviting, a new set of lawsuits. So it does seem like there's kind of a swimming against the tide feeling in a lot of this. For years, the talk, at least from voting rights groups, was about voter suppression. The idea that some of these laws were being passed in order to make it harder for people to register or vote. Even if these laws ended up not affecting turnout in the aggregate, they cause people to have to put a lot of resources into overcoming these barriers, and the barriers are put in place often for not good reasons. They don't really prevent fraud or promote voter confidence. So that's kind of a discussion we've been having for quite a long time. Since the 2020 election, we've now also been talking about election subversion, which I think it is something somewhat different, which is the concern that election results are not going to express the will of the voters because the vote totals are going to be manipulated, the processes are going to be manipulated. So I want to see if there's pushback on this point. When we start with you, Sophia, like, are these two separate things? How do we think about these two phenomena interacting? And, both you and Spencer talked about cultural phenomena. It certainly is true that the kind of what lays the groundwork for subversion is mass lack of belief that the election results are fake.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because as I started, been working in this for over a decade now, and sort of seeing new threats come to play, I had not really thought of them as separate things, right? Maybe as a matter of timeline in the election process, right? You have to, people are registering to vote, then they're voting, and then there's the counting process. And then what happens? But in my view, they're all sort of the same. From the perspective of the voter, is the will of the voter being reflected in policies, in their voice through policy, and who is elected and therefore representing them. And you can see a lot of things, not just in the election subversion, what we've been calling sort of election subversion, the will of the voters as expressed in the vote totals being undermined in some fashion and therefore either thrown out or some of the losers actually put into power and the like. But even in going past that, you sort of think about some of the other things that we've been seeing, attempts to deconstitute an elected body after the fact because maybe you're not liking what that's happening in places like targeted places like Detroit or like Houston and these types of places, or kicking out legislators from office who you aren't liking what they're saying, ejecting them. In my view, these are they're close cousins, if not sort of part of this sort of sense of voter suppression, right? Depending on how you're looking at the word. We can talk about vote suppression maybe as something a little bit different as part of the ballot process itself, just the act of voting. But if you're thinking about, as a country, what have we been doing to certain people and their voices? To me, these are all part of the same things that have just exploited people's cultural anxieties, people's a sense of lack of control, changing demographics, you name it. And they're just sort of a new version, a new form of what is unfortunately that has been a trend in our society and our country's history since the beginning.
Well, it does seem like it's kind of new tactic, right? I'm thinking you mentioned Houston. So we have a situation where Houston is a Democratic city. I don't know if it's majority Latino, but has substantial Latino population.
Well, a large
And
Asian
black
American
yeah.
population,
Yeah.
large white population as well.
And so the state of Texas has now basically passed some laws which limit the ability of Houston to run its own elections. And that's something that's fairly new for the modern period. And so I'm just wondering, maybe the tactics are changing. Spencer, like you were going to.
No, I really agree with Sophia in the sense that I have really always looked at voter suppression as a type of election subversion. I think that kind of the mainstream conventional piece has been, hey, overturning an election after the fact in kind of some authoritarian way, that is election subversion, and that is somehow new. But I think that people who feel as though they were not allowed to register to vote feel like, hey, that's not legitimate and there's not democracy there, even if they don't riot and anything else. I think that there is a lack of confidence there. I do think that there are a lot of mainstream folks who tolerate things like gerrymandering. Oh, that's just what politicians do. And then we get into, okay, this little restriction, some folks are they can't comply with this. And so some voter suppression, that's just the extremes of parties that are kind of fighting it out for political battle. That's not really democracy. But I do think that when you have an Edmund Pettus Bridge and there's some violence, or you have January 6th and there's some violence, then I think a lot of people start paying attention. And I just really think we should not be so comfortable, frankly, with any manipulation that prevents legitimate voters from casting ballots and participating, whether that's gerrymandering or suppression, et cetera. We shouldn't just become comfortable with that.
Okay, so you'd also put them in, they're not the same buckets, adjoining buckets.
Yeah, I think that they're all there. Yes. I'm with Sophia that this takes away from the legitimacy of democracy. Yeah.
So,
I agree with what you said. I view them as the same thing because I think at the heart of it, it's about whether or not someone's able to influence or have their right to vote respected. It's really, when you were speaking, it was really interesting because you said something, a legitimate voter, right? And I see this all the time now, and I'm sure you both do. We all do. People are asking, well, like I think that there is a question to some folks, like it's okay to do voter suppression because I don't view this person as a
Yes, I think you're
voter.
absolutely right.
And that's really scary. I do think that it's something that we all kind of get into with our own maybe personal politics or what we think of separately. Oh, how could this be that this person won? I don't know anyone who voted for them. There has to be something afoot. Like we've gamified politics over the past 50, 60 years in a way where now, you're right, gerrymandering, people think, oh, it's just partisan. Everything comes down to partisanship. And we know that that's not the case, especially it's generally a little more insidious than that. Partisanship is really wrapped up in, I think, racial politics as well. But I'm actually really concerned about our ideas of who are and aren't legitimate voters, because I think if we've gotten into a place as a society where we think some folks are not legitimate voters, then we do not care about their voter suppression, because we think that is the, oh, well, what, that doesn't matter. They're not real voters. And That kind of scares me. Everything does come down to what you said, Spencer, about culture. It's really scary.
So I think you're absolutely right in terms of this focus on kind of legitimate voters. I do think that there is this knee-jerk, almost anticipation of hands, like we're just opening the gate so that there's just pandemonium. They believe in just no police, defund the police, crime, pandemonium everywhere. Anyone can vote however many times. And so it's almost like there is this automatic reflexive, I'm just talking about legitimate, et cetera, right? It's almost like anticipating, like my whole world is framed up against Hans and what he is gonna say, which is unfortunate, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've even seen this in cases where public, like county officials, when they're talking about voting rights, said, well, I think that there are people coming here, like, why do those people get a district? Or they did it in public meetings, or like, I think that there's a bunch of people just voting illegally here in this county, in this rural county, because I don't want to respect the idea that someone is different than me
Right.
and wants a different electoral system and have their rights validated. People say the quiet part out loud all the time now. I really implore you to watch some local officials have meetings when they're talking about voting rights issues.
So let's delve a little deeper into this because, the theme here seems to be. I'm hearing much less that it's about elections being run in an unfair way and more about people not accepting the legitimacy of results. That creates the condition where election results can be manipulated. Maybe it's both of these things. But if it's primarily a cultural problem, the question is what we do about it. So I thought when I was writing just before the pandemic hit in 2020, that if we could actually hold a free and fair election, then I knew lies about the election being manipulated were coming, but I thought they'd gain no traction because there would be no there. Then COVID hit and I thought, oh no, things are going to go really bad because, we're changing all of the rules now because more people want to vote by mail and the systems are going to be overloaded and there's going to be losses. And then we had, I think, a pretty good election in terms of, people being able to get access to the ballot despite this and votes being fairly counted. The two things that we should care about in a fair election: voter access and voter integrity and election integrity. And yet that didn't make a dent in the willingness of people to say that the election was stolen and cause this kind of cultural issue. And I think this may only be supercharged by new technologies. So let me bring in the AI piece of this, that just thinking about what we saw in 2020, what lessons we can learn from 2020, and like, are things going to be worse in 2024 in terms of false information about voting? And is that going to affect, how willing people are to accept elections?
Yeah. So, you have written really a seminal piece in terms of deepfakes and cheap speech. And I definitely think generative AI is going to have an effect in terms of, deepfakes. But I think that AI is going to transform various aspects of our election system, and it's not just disinformation, and it's not just deceptive practices. Yes, because of natural language processing, you don't have to be a coding expert to do a lot of this stuff. But there are a lot of other challenges when we talk about cyber attacks that are facilitated because you don't have to know how to code to create, to facilitate cyber attacks, to create code for cyber attacks. When we talk about targeting election officials with threats and images, when we talk about fake open records requests, sham that are just flooding into an Apache County, Arizona, or or in Wayne County, Detroit here, And I think even absent this intentional discrimination, we've got bias in terms of creating content, moderating content in terms of the platforms, detecting deepfakes, the technologies that detect deepfakes, actually, there is bias in their ability to detect deepfakes of people of different racial backgrounds, verifying mail-in ballot signatures, you know, a variety of tactics across the board. So I am concerned that this is going to spread, and, you know, that this is a tool that will facilitate kind of more division and more of the problems we've been talking about.
Sophia, you're at the ACLU and they have a whole speech side. And, you know, there's concern about, well, you know, seeing a lot of what some people call disinformation on social media platforms and elsewhere, of course. And then the question is, you know, how should the First Amendment come into this discussion? And so how do you think, looking from the lessons from 2020, looking forward to 2024 and kind of information environment and these cultural risks that you found that, how do you think we should balance all of this, and what, you know, what should we be looking for and what should we do?
Big question. Big question.
Save us.
I know, big question. But I want to push back for one moment on sort of the, you know, whether sort of processes are a big concern of that, and in this versus, you know, whether people think that, you know, it's about, you know, acceptance of the election outcomes. Processes, in my view, are gonna matter a lot, right? This is the bulk of the work that we are doing here at the ACLU, SMA does as well, right? Just ensuring that, what is concerning me is this sort of win at all costs attitude that is, kind of making it even more difficult to protect those processes. But then in addition, there's that belief that it doesn't really matter to some people that we have a strong process. What matters is the outcome. And that at the end of the day, in terms of, for example, passing more federal protections or a baseline of protections for voters across the board, you know, that's not going to be something that's going to get support from some people. So that
It's
does
not
not
happening
bode
for the next
well.
election.
Correct. That's certainly not happening with the next election. I worry about prospects going forward for many reasons. In terms of the question of balancing, you know, all of our constitutional rights kind of going forward to this election, you know, it's something we wrestle with a great deal at the ACLU, but I think one of the concerns that we have focused on is really this question of, you know, why is it that, how can you get correct information to people? Unfortunately, I think these deep fakes, the software to create these misinformation campaigns and whatnot are sort of out of the hands of people that can be regulated in some instances and are now in the hands of foreign people sitting on their couches in countries around the world, and we're going to be flooded with misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes, and the like. What do you do about that? And part of the problem from our perspective, at least from my perspective, I should say, is no one knows who to trust for information anymore. Somehow it's become, you either, if you already believe certain things, you go to some place for information, if you believe other things, you go to other places for information, but there isn't sort of a neutral accepted source of correct information about election processes, where to go vote and how to go vote, that you can feel confident, you can direct people to, and they will feel confident that they're getting correct information. Part of that problem is this local question that we talked about, right? You should be able to go to your local election office officials and know, right, that this is correct information and getting it right. But unfortunately, in many instances, these are under-resourced organizations, people, and they're not getting information necessarily out and about. So you know, to me, while there is this problem, we have to balance what people are able to say, and there's definitely a line that's hard to navigate in the disinformation field. If you want to correct obvious falsehoods as quickly and widely as possible, but I think there's a bigger problem with who's the messenger? How do you cut through the noise and make sure for the voter they're getting that information they trust that information.
And one of the things that our ad hoc committee, when we issued our report, we recommended that election officials get kind of official social media status, so voters could know that they're seeing in real time responses, and we saw some of that in Arizona when there were problems in Maricopa County. Whether it's cutting through the noise, it's really hard to say. Sonny, I want to come back to this question, but through this local lens. I mean, you said it's primarily a local problem. In some ways, it's kind of a national or even international problem because, kind of undermining trust in institutions is the major issue. And yet that ends up translating into, say, what local board in Shasta County, California, that wants to do hand counting of ballots, which we know is much less accurate and going to be much slower. With slow results undermine people's confidence. Where are the votes? So, how do we kind of deal with this national local overlap?
Yeah, well, one thing that Sophia said that was so interesting to me and kind of made me think about some research that I've done at the UCLA Voting Rights Project was about folks not knowing who to trust. I was really lucky to get to do some focus groups with voters who are actually primarily on voters with disabilities, but voters, they have the same issues as all voters, and so many of them, I think almost every single one of the voters we interviewed said, I just want someone to cut through all of this noise. I don't want information from the political parties. I don't want to go to Facebook. I want a local official to tell me more information, and that's every single one of these voters crave that. And I bet you it's not just a California thing. I think that if you interview voters across the country, people crave their local governments who are administering their elections to be more forward and out there with them to talk about what the election process looks like, how they could view it themselves, and where they can get some just regular information about early voting, local voting, the processes. Voters like knowing how a signature on a ballot, gets reviewed. They want to know that process and what happens. And maybe I'm a little naive, but I think that for the most part, local officials who are doing election administration actually do want people to go out and vote and to have a good experience and to want to run the system fairly. They're constrained by budgetary issues and by state law and by a lot of outside groups also lobbying them. But for the most part, most of the local registrars that I've interacted with across the country really have a dedication to their job and to voters. And so on this local issue, I think it is us realizing that we have, as a society, given a lot of way to political parties, to the media on educating voters about voting, about a civil right. And we really, as a society, have to say we need to fund our local election officials to be able to do their jobs and fund them in a way where they're able to get out information about voting. And it could be, we have candidate pamphlets in California. They're not really pamphlets, they are magazines to know more about voters, but people read them and people like them, and just I'm open to suggestions, but I think that is really, we have to have the government or local officials take back some of that power to be able to educate voters on the fair processes that there are.
I'm going to come to your questions in the audience, and after one more round here, I want to come back to this question of demobilization and messages to voters. Steve, let me start with you. Talking about all this stuff itself can be overwhelming. It's like, it's just not worth it. And so, is there a need for a communications strategy? Or I'm sure there are people working on communication strategy. Are the communication strategies failing? Because, when I go around the country and I speak, I hear that same despair. It's like, is this even worth it? And that kind of defeatist attitude itself undermines the potential for democracy if people, self-select out of participating.
Well, that's certainly I feel feedback that I've gotten, and when I've offered optimism, or at least I would say in a historical context for much of what we're talking about and seeing, this point about legitimate voters, that's not new. I mean, maybe it feels new right this moment, because we had a period of time where there was more consensus around making voting more accessible. But it's not new, and we've moved as a society around some of these issues and figure out ways to deal with it. But the feedback I've often gotten is, when you've said things that are optimistic and make me feel optimistic, that is the best part of what you've said. Right, so there is a balance from all of us who work in this field, I think, between saying, yes, there are risks and there are problems, there are things that we should be concerned about. This is a perilous moment for us as a country because of what we're, the kinds of things that we are seeing, the kinds of attacks, the kinds of rhetoric, the strategies and tactics. But there is a path forward. There is still, and it's still important for you to be engaging, right? This is all premised on all of us choosing as citizens of this country, as people living in this country, people raising families here, right? To make choices about who you want running this country, who you want to be representing you need to be participating in that. You have to buy into the system if you want to have that optimism too, right? And you do your part. It's challenging though, because at the same time, you want to sort of sound the alarm to create the reforms necessary, right? To get people to understand where they should be putting their efforts in at the moment. But that's the sort of feedback I've gotten. We've gotten to a point where people are overwhelmed by the number of things that they hear could go wrong, that they don't even know where to start. And the asks I've been hearing, okay, so how do I get started? What are the little things? And we're going back to basics. Make a plan to vote, figure out how to vote, bring a friend, host a voting party. Okay, once you got that, we can talk about other things. But it's almost felt like we've had to go back to those basics of, you just have to take that first step, participate in this process.
I just want to build on this historical context that Sophia laid out. And I just think we got to remember here that the last quarter of our history has been so much more successful in terms of democracy than the first three quarters, right? When we talk about 1790, and a naturalization act that limits citizenship to white people of good moral character, right? That basically existed through 1965. When we talk about voting that was delegated to the states and was largely limited to white males for an extensive period of time, and our one attempt at a multiracial democracy in the aftermath of the Civil War was very short-lived, right? So we really had some amazing accomplishments with, before 1965, 1960, 75% of immigrants in the United States were from Europe, right? Today, that's only 10%, right? Our population has changed just incredibly. Now, about 25% of members of Congress are people of color. That was about 1% in 1945, right? So we've made this great progress, and understandably, there is kind of a backlash, some anxiety here, and we just got to be honest about it. Right now, race is the most significant factor in driving voting patterns. It's more significant than religion, than sexual orientation, than education, than income, than gender, than marital status. It is a significant factor. Zoli Haenel, who's at UC San Diego, has a lot of literature on this. He's a political scientist. And the world has changed in terms of globalization, AI, in terms of jobs. We shouldn't be surprised that some folks are experiencing cultural anxiety. And our answer cannot be, hey, we just got to turn out more people and beat them back and silence them, etc. We have got to create a pluralistic democracy that has a place for everyone, even the haters, even the doubters, have to have a place in terms of what we're trying to build. So I say all that to say, this is all kind of natural in terms of this space that we're in. This is just a backlash to this kind of natural progression. And for us to take our next step toward being a pluralistic, multiracial democracy, this is something we've got to go through.
So,
Well, I feel like a little bit of progress, because I just agree with you guys on everything that you're saying, but I think part of it also, you really just gotta believe it. It's hard because we all, I think I said this earlier, but we all fall into patterns, like, how can this be that this person won over this person? You know, we have to believe in election results and really not get into the idea that when something doesn't go, and this is for everyone, right? When something doesn't go our way politically or electorally, that there is something amiss afoot. You know, it's interesting to see in 2020, you know, more people turned out. I think that we had record high turnout. It was partially because people had more accessible ways to vote. So we're seeing that actually making voting more accessible, help educating people, even in states that, for example, like didn't have robust vote by mail, people wanted to use it, people liked it, and now in some of those states, they've kept vote by mail systems and we're trying to expand it. People want to vote, they want to participate in their democracy, and I think that it is a little scary to know where to start. It's hard, and a lot of the people doing the education are not, you know, it's not really the government so much, it's not really the schools, it's political parties. We've really relinquished a lot of our responsibility as citizens to asking political parties to target voters. And they're gonna spend money on targeting voters that they are gonna turn out for them too. And so getting people to vote and talking to all voters is really important in having people have buy-in. I don't know how we get that, getting folks to talk to all voters. Maybe it's just people being willing to talk to their neighbors. But, you know, expanding processes to allow voting to be easier, removing unnecessary barriers that were put in place on the guise of security and fraud. But if you ask someone, how does this prevent fraud in the reality? Like, you know, you're more likely to get struck by lightning. I think that was Professor Levitt from Loyola, than you are to have someone commit voter fraud. It's because it's a little arduous to swipe someone's ballot and have to figure out you can, you know, sign their name correctly. Usually you'll get flagged. I've gotten my own ballot flagged when I lived in Arizona, and I signed my name the way that I sign my name usually. So someone called me up and I had to cure my ballot. But, you know, telling people that the process is be confident in the process, get out to vote, make a plan to vote. If something goes awry, if your ballot gets flagged for a reason, that is okay. They're doing their job. You should feel good that maybe someone contacted you and wanted you to cure your ballot, right? Now, some states don't have ballot curing, and that's also hard. But I'm trying to be a little bit more optimistic about society and voting. Maybe it's because I live in California, but I see voting as something that it should be a little bit, when it's more accessible, people want to use it.
But part of the issue, I think, with this fraud issue is that, you know, 20 years ago, when Rick and I were talking about this, you know, it was Hans and John Fund who were talking about, you know, some imaginary fraud without real facts behind it, right? And now it's kind of like the presumptive nominee of one of our major parties who kind of has it as a talking point in terms of, you know, now 20 years later, we've got a court that basically says, even without evidence, this is a legitimate state interest. There are no numbers. We just are people and their concerns and their cultural anxiety here in terms of being concerned about fraud. That is a sufficient justification to prevent some, here I'm gonna do it again, legitimate voters from casting ballots here, right? And so just this fraud thing is all around us and embraced as something real, even despite the fact that we lay out numbers and evidence, because it's not necessarily about the evidence and actual fraud. It's about this culture, it's about some anxiety, it's about something else that's deeper than real fraud and this real concern, right?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying, that we just have to allow ourselves to believe election results, even when they don't go our way. Like, fraud is fraud because it's an excuse. If I didn't win, there was something to say because maybe illegal voters were voting, or there were someone stuffing ballot boxes. Like, we just have to believe in election results. And that's hard, right? Because people don't want to believe that they could have lost, because we have gamified politics. And a lot of this is just a cultural, it's so much of it is cultural too, to a certain respect. Now, it's not all cultural, there's a lot of processes involved.
I'm sorry to push back a
Yeah.
little, right? It's a problem though, if we're casting doubt on the process, right? And at least from my perspective, we are legitimately saying that in some instances, right, we're creating barriers, constitutional barriers and lawful barriers for people to be able to access the ballot, right?
Yeah,
So is it surprising then that some voters then see this process as unfortunately against them in some fashion? Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't still, accept the results of the process, but I think it's part of our work to be questioning whether or not the structures that have been put in place are fair, are ones that foster the kind of political participation that we want to see. And in fact, that's what we fought, people have fought for and died for along the way. So,
it's hard to tell people, it's hard to do voter work where you're suing states and localities on voter suppression and vote denial cases, and then also tell people that elections have to, because you're saying like there's something amiss, or there's something wrong with the effect or the implementation or why it was implemented, but then also you need to respect election results, it's very hard. So I agree with you, like, it's good pushback because it's hard you want to tell voters, I think I want to personally believe that elections are free and fair, and I know that I do the work to make sure they're free and fair, but I also know that there are folks, even in our own families, probably that feel like, oh, well, if that person won, it's because something's wrong, right? Like, well, maybe it's just because that person won.
I'm gonna stop this conversation just to see if you have any audience questions. Anybody? Yes.
My name is Minova. I was just a few days ago reading in the Daily Growing a research project done by a student association in regard to the participation of the voting in March. The age from 18 to, I'm not 100% sure, but like 25 years old, like the young students. It was like participation of 7%. And I was like shocked by that because I didn't think it would be so bad. So my question is, how could they be motivated or educated? I mean, if already, young people are apathetic, And my personal experience has also always been when I ask somebody that they rather don't want to talk about it. And so my question is, for any one of you, what do you see as a possibility to emphasize the importance of this election? Because I don't want to put this in my question right now, but I read investigative journalism, and I think if this is not going maintaining this government, it might be the last election, because there are very dangerous things going on. So I just, please.
Youth participation and turnout is something that you're all seeing on the ground. That's an issue.
Yeah, definitely. It's really, I think it's just hard to know how to message voters to get out to vote, but I think part of it is that there isn't like a very robust mechanism to get first-time voters out to vote, and that's generally what young people are first-time voters. I'm not sure if there's a lot of folks who are smarter than me and do a lot of research on this topic about, election day as a holiday, as like instituting more aggressive and robust civics education. Just making sure we're making people feel like they have to be included, right? Other countries, voting is a little bit more of a is more about cultural participation. I think about, in Australia, I believe they have a tax, right? Like a small little fee that you have to pay. But in Taiwan, they don't have secret ballots. So if you want to vote, you gotta go to your civic center and people, raise their hand if they want a candidate, and that it's really interesting, right? Because people there, they're small, it's almost like a caucus that they're doing for their national and local elections. Here, that there's really no big group of cultural participation around getting people to the ballot for young voters. I know that exists for a lot of for a lot of different groups, but not so much for young voters.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact solution is. I know that it is not requiring some citizenship test of people who are under 25. This has been proposed by, a presidential candidate, right? And I also think that this has some racial implications because there are certain populations in our country that skew younger, certainly Latino community skews a little younger. And I'm really interested in this 26th Amendment challenge to absentee carve-outs for only senior citizens, right? So there are some who say, hey, mail-in ballot is terrible because there's all this fraud, but you gotta have, mail-in ballots for people who are over 65. That's the no excuse period. So it's interesting in terms of this 26th Amendment challenge to that rule that says, hey, no, that violates the 26th Amendment, that everybody should have the same access to a ballot, including vote by mail.
Actually, in one of our cases.
All right, that's good. You got it when people are citing your cases.
Yeah.
We do know that one of the best predictors of people not voting is that they're not registered to vote.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but so, in my election law class, we brought in, the LA and Orange County registrars, and they were talking about their experiences on UC campuses. Guess what matters a lot here? Same day voter registration, because
Right.
lots of young people don't think about voting until it's actually election day and they've never registered to vote.
Right.
So that, if that were nationwide, you had same day voter registration. And the way same day voter registration works is you vote essentially a provisional ballot, they confirm that you're eligible, and then your vote is counted. That's something that could bring people.
Yep.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Let me thank our panelists. Please join me in thanking them. I don't want to say it made me optimistic, but the word I use, is hopeful. And we'll be back with an event next week with California Attorney General Rob Bonta. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon.